Hey guys, and welcome back to Rage Gaming. Today I'm talking about vrising. This is the survival ARPG from Stunlock Studios that's finally going into its 1.0 release on May 8th. With that, we were contacted to check out the game and make a video however we'd like while trying the 1.0 release version a bit early. So thank you to Stunlock for sponsoring the video and for being very relaxed on what we wanted to make. Today I'm giving you a quick overview of what the game actually is, my first impressions of trying it, and what's new in 1.0. 1.0 is launching on PC via Steam, though there will be a PlayStation 5 version to follow later in the year. But what's the game itself? What's the setup? You begin after centuries of sleep as a vampire that's very hungry. To gain power, you're going to need resources, to craft better gear, to build a proper castle to function from, and fill it with minions to help run it. So naturally, that's going to involve a lot of blood, drinking it sure, but also spending it on say vampiric powers. By killing enemies in general, we get that tiny progression, but items and materials to use or craft with, defeating the big enemies, that holds the most value. Special bosses in this game are called V-Bloods, and they're all around the world, which we can track and hunt them down. Proper boss fights with unique mechanics for each of them, but reward new powers to try, recipes to craft better gear, progress the castle and more. Speaking of which, building and progression, this is a survival game at its core. The game takes place on this massive map with these connected regions. And post 1.0, we have a new one in the endgame, the ruins of Mortium, and some kind of shadow realm. But having wandered around and progressed far enough to say touch on iron equipment, I've basically only been around Farbane Woods and the farmlands just a little bit, the big areas. To survive though, you have to remember you're a vampire. That means for the day and night cycle, you're at serious threat in the day. The sun will burn you and will even kill you if you stay in it for a few seconds too long. That plays into the shadows mechanic then, where you've got trees and tents and walls and so on, all casting shadows you need to weave in and out of even mid-fight. Those shadows move as the sun does, which can be very helpful or awkward. It can be pretty brutal at times though, but there's always a shadow somewhere to dip in, even in the worst situations. Getting around the big map can be pretty slow if you're not using transformations. There's the early one to get, the wolf form, which lets you move a bit quicker, jump over terrain, and importantly, it means other animals won't attack you, which can be very nice. I've also unlocked the rat form for sneaking past enemies that could catch you if you were to run right into or past them. Other forms exist, like the bear form I'm looking at next, but there's also the new spider form in 1.0, which lets you dig underground to avoid enemies. Also working as a way to hide from the sun, which is pretty helpful. Now, as you run around, there's going to be enemies of progressing level to match your current power, which is tied to your experience and your gear level. There's absolutely enemies and bosses that are going to be well above your pay grade at first. It's definitely a weak state to start in, but that does seem to pass pretty quickly once you get some powers to, properly rely on. Speaking of which, let's look at those vampire power options. In ability selection, we can choose which kind of abilities to run. We've got 5 specializations of Blood, Unholy, Illusion, Chaos, and Frost to start with, though I do see one here called Storm Magic that I couldn't choose any options of just yet. There's lots of things to unlock via progression within these trees that I have access to. From any of these, I can have a travel ability like the Dodge type, 2 basic abilities, and 1 ultimate ability from any of the specializations. You unlock more options by hunting the V-Bloods, and that's also how I unlock my first ultimate, where I'm summoning a kind of massive explosive spider. On top of that, we have weapons, which come with their own unique skills. They will offer you more and more options as you upgrade them, and there's many kinds of skills, from offensive, defensive, utility, supportive. You can create a build and a playstyle around your goals. So if you're playing in a team, spreading the kinds of abilities you have is a good idea, but solo has required more selfish survival style setups in my experience. And something cool in 1.0 that I can't really imagine playing without at this point is their more kind magic unlock system. You can kill V-Bloods to get magic type points to spend on abilities you want from the tree, whereas before you'd have to go kill a specific boss to get a specific ability. So it frees up what you actually are able to unlock a lot sooner, which seems a lot nicer. Another part of your powers though as a vampire is of course to drain targets to suck the blood. You have this kind of blood meter at the bottom left, as you can see, which can be spent on a bunch of stuff. The main thing I use it for though is channeling a heal. Regularly feeding on people to keep that blood up so I can spend it seems very important. All you need to do is lower an enemy's health and then you can drain them, pretty much instant killing them, but you have to channel it for a bit. That leaves you exposed, so you have to do that when it's safe. You can also do it to animals and other stuff if you are desperate. Plus, you get different kinds of buffs when you drain different blood types. Buffs make a big impact, so feeding on different blood types regularly to get a bunch of buffs does seem really helpful. Now, on the other end, away from magical stuff, there's the weapons. As you can see, I've got 4 generally equipped. In this case, it's a 2-handed sword, duo axes, a big blunt hammer, and also a spear. There's a bunch of weapon types in the game. Each of them has different basic and special attacks, and generally you use them based on what enemy you're fighting. Because you can have 4 equipped at once, you're able to swap smoothly mid-combat if you're fighting a group of enemies that requires something else. Maybe you're just fighting a group of enemies, so having a cleave of a sword or axe, that can be good. Or maybe you want to fight back at range with a bow or something. So speaking of which, 1.0 did add 2 new weapon types, that being the bow and the whip, so there's even more options now. Combat in general, you move around a fight trying to evade their attacks while dealing out your own. In 1.0 they launched controller support, so that's what I've been playing on to try it rather than mouse and keyboard, and it's felt pretty smooth. My various abilities are just on basic keybinds at the bottom right, and I can use the D-pad to swap between weapons or abilities. There's the aiming of your attacks with the right stick while you move around at the same time with the left stick. I'd circle enemies, avoid the telegraphs, dodge missiles and all that kind of thing, no problem, all while still attacking them. The longer the fights go on though, I noticed my main health bar would drop and drop. It seems actually very important to stay healthy, to heal sooner rather than later, to keep your max health kind of going. But now let's talk properly about the V-Blood bosses and how they work. You can check the list of V-Bloods in the menu. It's this big progression of bosses raising in level with different rewards. Special abilities like new transformations, like the early V-Blood, which is the wolf, or new crafting recipes for gear or building, as well as, yes, specific points for magic too. The first one's pretty straightforward, but it gets more mechanically interesting pretty quick. There's this armorer who spreads tons of traps and tries to move you around into them, but if you equip some of the armor that he's made laying around, you get this invulnerability even though you can't attack, which means you can run around and clear the traps, intentionally running into them to keep the fight more manageable. Interestingly, you can also drag enemies from the nearby area into these bosses. Some of them are in set locations, some are roaming around, which does mean the mini bosses can also be dragged in, which is a big mistake that I made once. This necromancer type was summoning a ton of minions during the fight, for example, exploding projectiles, spiraling out shots in AoE that turn and twist. A lot to keep track of solo, especially if you're bringing in enemies from the outside. But either way, as your power level goes up, you can challenge higher up enemies into Act 2 and beyond. I was able to fight enemies above my pay grade, but at a certain point, too much damage is too much damage. They have added more to the endgame with new bosses and new progression, but all of this is new to me. Now, I also mentioned the castle, base building. That's a really important part of any survival game. In short, you'll be building up a castle wherever you want. In an open server, the location will be important around other players, and if you're dealing with PvP, that could be a problem. To do it though, we kind of set up a heart of the castle, feed it blood to power it, get some floors down, clear the terrain, build up some basic walls, classic base building stuff. You've got crafting benches, refinement, research for new recipes, and vampire themed stuff like coffins to set your respawn, create anti-sunlight devices to keep the castle hidden away from the sun at all times. We can get humans to run things for us by going out, dominating them instead of draining blood, stealing them for the base, turning them into vampires. And obviously you got basic stuff like storage options, lighting, many kinds of aesthetic options to get the building into more of a castle shape. A lot of what you can do long term seems pretty incredible, very on theme, but where you place the castle's pretty important. Maybe you put it really far from where you're currently exploring. And as we progress into new zones, that can be awkward. So in 1.0, they've added a feature where you can move your castle, so I'm sure people are pleased about that. The main progression of the game though is to raise your character power through your spells, skills, however you want to upgrade those and unlock more. There's also your gear, so your weapons and armor, their stats and effects, their quality. You'll craft yourself some bone gear to begin with, reinforce it, go to copper, reinforce that, improve that, raise yourself to iron, and so on, like a normal survival game. There are new details though in 1.0, like something called an ancestral forge for new ancestral weapon upgrades. New weapons and armor have been added, and they've added customization options, so you can actually personalize what you're wearing visually. You also always have some kind of main objective going while you're working your way up. That's shown at the top left. In my case, I was just beginning to work on iron gear at this point and exploring the farmland zone for the first time. But raising the level of your castle, roaming to hunt V-Bloods, mess with other players, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, as long as you're willing to take on the challenge. Speaking of which, there's now difficulty options to make things much harder. They added a new mode called Brutal, so if you played the game a good amount before, this is probably the way to go. Gonna make the enemies way more challenging. The progression obviously becomes more difficult, but personally I was playing on standard, so I'm just learning. Apparently there's also been a lot of quality of life changes in 1.0, such as new UI improvements to say your inventory management, the visuals being nicer because they're using like a new light engine. There's also the new achievement system for those interested in more of a completionist approach. And a big part of the new endgame beyond what I've been playing is linked to the Castlevania collaboration. Like I said, there's a new endgame region and also the Shadow Realm. Apparently Dracula is trying to make a return and brings an army with him. That means lots of new enemy types, but also new bosses like Dracula, yeah, but Simon Belmont as well. I think the main objective is to go into the Shadow Realm and attack Dracula's new castle, eventually fighting Dracula, kind of like Castlevania. But yeah, that brings us to the conclusion of this first impressions overview. Pretty unique survival game with the top-down camera, the day and night cycle, and how that really impacts the gameplay. The castle building is pretty impressive. The visuals and theme are really good. And I'm also a huge fan of the Castlevania anime series, so I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on with that when I get in the later game. If you guys want to check out the game though, be sure to use our link in the description. It's available now on PC via Steam. And again, again, there's going to be a PS5 launch later in the year. Once again, a big thank you to Stunlock for sponsoring us to make a video just to check out the game. It's always really nice when devs are relaxed and just want you to try their game and talk about it. It says a lot about the confidence. If you guys have any extra advice for new players like myself though, be sure to let us know in the comments. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.